Welcome to our Spotlight Matthew devotional for today as we continue through this section of the Gospel from chapter 14 through chapter 20, which we are calling the training of the 12. In our last devotional, we saw how John the Baptist came to a demise, how he was beheaded because of a promise made by Herod the Tetrarch to the daughter of his wife Herodias, and upon dancing, Herodias asked for John's head on a plate. And what I want us to know in that situation as we pick up for today's passage is that Jesus and John the Baptist were the closest of friends and colleagues with one another. And so we might imagine that when the disciples of John the Baptist bring word to Jesus of John's gruesome and bizarre beheading, that this shakes Jesus. Now, I want us to stop and remember, Jesus is fully divine. He has a fully divine nature, but he also has a fully human nature, albeit without sin. That makes him unlike the rest of us. But he does have this human nature, and as a human being, we think that sometimes Jesus doesn't have feelings or emotions that would impact him. But that's not the case. Jesus, I believe it's reasonable to assume here, not a stretch, that when Jesus gets this word of what has happened to John, it impacts him deeply. He is shaken, he is hurt and wounded. He is indeed in a situation where he emotionally has been vexed by the report, and the wind has been knocked out of him. And so let's read, first of all, Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 14, and consider it briefly, and then turn to the feeding of the 5,000 in verses 15 through 21. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Here we have Jesus. And what does Jesus do when he hears the word that his best friend in ministry, the man who had been his forerunner and spotlighted his ministry, what was his reaction when he receives this news that his best friend in ministry and closest colleague for the sake of the good news had been beheaded and met his death in such a horrible and just actually awful and senseless fashion? Well, I think Jesus knew he needed to withdraw. He went to a desolate place. Jesus needed time alone with God to process what he had just heard. He needed it because John was a close friend, and I believe it's reasonable to think he may have needed it as well because we read in chapter 12, verse 14, that the really religious already are out to destroy Jesus, and he receives word that the greatest ministry colleague he has was indeed destroyed, executed, and therefore Jesus is in a perilous place, a dangerous place in regard to his ministry every bit as much as John was. And so Jesus needs this time to withdraw because he's lost someone dear to him. Let's pause with that for just a moment, because many of us have lost dear ones, people very close to us. Hopefully we have not lost them through the violence that John lost his life to and that Jesus is trying to absorb into his soul at this point. But we have lost loved ones. And when we do, it impacts us. If indeed Jesus was emotionally altered and emotionally stricken by the word of John, his dear friend, being beheaded, we indeed can be emotionally struck as well. And we might take a note from Jesus to know that we need sometimes, when we have had such a loss, to withdraw. We don't just necessarily brush it off and say, this doesn't matter. No, we go to the Father and we take time to process it with our Abba Father who loves us in the midst of life's losses. And it's just good for us to know too, that when we have had a loss, Jesus understands. Jesus knows what it is to lose one's closest friend in ministry and colleague, someone he had known from his childhood. And therefore we can turn to Jesus, who will have compassion on us when we absorb such losses. But then the crowds pursue him. They just won't give him an opportunity. We could understand, at least I could understand, if Jesus had said, give me a break, I need a timeout, leave me alone. I just lost John the Baptist and heard news in this horrible, horrible fashion. But no, Jesus sees the needs of the people, as we read in chapter 9, verses 35 through 38, and he is moved with compassion. And on one hand, when we've had a great loss, sometimes we do need to withdraw and spend time with our loving Heavenly Father. That's an absolutely right response. But there are other times when we need, in the midst of our loss, to go and have compassion on other people in their needs and their hardships as well. The best medicine sometimes can be to get our minds and hearts off our great losses and get our minds and hearts on to serving and helping other people. And it actually can be a way in which God brings healing and brings the power for us to move forward in our Christian life, as in the midst of our loss, we minister to people in their loss as well. It's not an either and, I don't think. It's a both and. But there takes wisdom knowing when we need to withdraw and find that quiet place when we've suffered a loss, and when we need to extend ourselves and get out of the way of our loss by ministering to other people. And that's what Jesus does, some of both of these. Well, we come now to the feeding of the 5,000, plus women and children who are not counted. And we read of a great miracle. We looked at the mighty works of Jesus in chapters 8 and 9, and Jesus displayed his power over nature when he calmed the sea, the wind, and the waves. Well, here Jesus shows another commanding power over the laws or the forces of nature, because he says to the disciples, bring me the food that you have, 5 fish and 2 loaves. And through a miracle of multiplication, Jesus takes something that naturally could only feed perhaps a handful of people and feeds 5,000 plus women and children. Some people have tried to say that there was no real miracle here. Jesus just took and blessed and broke and gave the bread in front of the great crowd of people, and this inspired them to take food out of their satchels and bags and to share it among the others. There's absolutely nothing in this passage that would lead one to think that that is what is occurring. No, if we would abide by and put our faith in what the text is teaching, Jesus did this miracle of feeding with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, interestingly, Jesus says to the disciples, you give them something to eat. And all they do is give him the 5 loaves and 2 fish. They don't perform the miracle. But they do give the crowd something to eat, because Jesus, after he takes and blesses and breaks and gives that to the disciples, they are the ones who go out and distribute the miraculous feeding to these people. And so they have the honor, they have the privilege of participating in the miracle, not because they execute the miracle, but because Jesus delivers his miracle through them. This is a good teaching for us as well. We, like the disciples, should bring what we have to Jesus. And what we bring to Jesus in and of ourselves is little. It's our 5 loaves and our 2 fish. But we offer them up to Jesus. And when we give them to Jesus, as he decides to take them and to bless them and to break them and to give them, that he then includes us in forwarding his miraculous work in this world. So it's never a case where if Jesus does something miraculous that we healed someone or we multiplied something or we have that gift and power. It's always Jesus' gift and power. But he distributes his gift and power through his people when his people give their little to him and ask him to make much of it. And I would ask you to do that, and for me to do that. What is the little that we have that we can give to Jesus today, and ask him to take it and to bless it, to break it, and to give it through us to others, so that he might work his works in the world today, and we might get to participate as instruments and conduits by which he touches and impacts the world in our time. That's our teaching for today, Spotlight Good News Matthew. Check us out on spotlightgoodnews.com, like us on Facebook, and share us with others, and we will continue to Spotlight Matthew in our next devotional.